Glad to be with you this morning. Thanks for coming. Take care of a couple quick announcements before we get into the Word this morning. A couple important things for you to know about. Hope you get involved in. The first one up is October 21st, our Marriage Matters Ministry, a team that I'm working with. We have our date night coming up with Phil Gungor. Phil is the son of Mark Gungor, who has run Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage for decades now. A hilarious opportunity to be together with your spouse for the night, a chance to hear about how to strengthen your marriage, but in a funny way. It's a really great opportunity to be open to other churches as well, but we're excited to be hosting it here, and we want to get your tickets. Just hit that QR code. You can buy your tickets that night or tonight and then be ready for October 21st. Second, we want to just let you know that if you're interested at all in being part of our Christmas Eve choir, we'll have 2 Christmas Eve services. If you want to be there, it's a major part of our messages, our services that day. You can scan that QR code or find someone in the lobby who has a lanyard on with that same QR code. You can see my daughter, if she hasn't already harassed you about being in the choir yet. I'm sure she will soon. But a really important part, you do not have to be a professional singer. You just have to want to be involved. And then lastly, we have our youth group, current missions drive right now called Souls for Souls. Our youth group is running a shoe drive for kids and adults in other countries who do not have footwear. Now, the great thing about this is it doesn't matter what shoes look like. How old, you don't even have to have both of them. They'll take one. And I'm not joking, that's true. So if you just bring in the shoes that are good condition, bad condition, or anything in between, they will put them to good use in places where kids and families do not have shoes, in very difficult, dangerous places where their feet are not protected. If you'll drop them in the box outside by the welcome desk, the youth group will be collecting them, boxing them up, and sending them off. So we hope you'll get involved in one of those opportunities to serve and be a part of the Daily Church family. So this morning, you all began by saying, I'm no longer a slave to fear because I'm a child of God. And we're going to challenge that today a little bit. We've been sharing these stories from I Did Not See That Coming series, which have been stories from the Gospels in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from Jesus and his life here on earth as a man, as he went through the temptations and trials that we faced, to experience humanity himself and to take on our sins on his back. And so today's story is no different. I want to remind you again, the stories chosen in the Gospels and those inspired by the Holy Spirit were the ones chosen for a very specific reason. They are not stories just to tell us what happened. They're stories because they have lessons for us today in them. These stories have been selected because you and I have something to learn in them. And so today's story, and I did not see that coming, takes us into Matthew chapter 14, where Jesus finds himself on the side of a mountain with the disciples at the feeding of the 5,000. Verse 22, it says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So I want to set the stage for you right here. Very important piece here. That what has happened in Matthew chapter 14, verse 21, and before that is the feeding of the 5,000. So there's a group of 5,000 plus people gathered on the side of a mountain there to hear Jesus teach. And these people had all gathered and been there for a long time. They were hungry and there was no food. There was a little boy, he had some fish and some bread. And Jesus took that loaf and fish and he turned it into enough food to feed 5,000 people with leftovers. So a very big miracle had just occurred. And at the end of that miracle, that's where we find ourselves in verse 22 when he says, and he made the disciples get into a boat and go ahead of him. Now, when they got on that boat and they went ahead of him, they're going to head out on the Sea of Galilee, sometimes known as the Lake of Tiberias. Very large sea in the middle of the area, which the disciples had been on plenty of times. This is not an unusual situation. There was only one way to get from one side of the land to the other, or at least the fastest way, was to take a boat. So Jesus in verse 22 says he sends them ahead, makes them get into the boat. Now here's the question, of course. Now what we do know, and I'm going to give you a little head start on this, is they're going to end up in a storm in a few minutes. You're going to find them in that storm. The question is then, so Jesus feeds the 5,000. He tells them, he actually makes them, says he made them get into the boat, and he sends them off into the Sea of Galilee. And the question then becomes, if the storm is coming, did Jesus know it? Well, I hope we all know enough about Jesus to know he knew the storm was coming, right? He controls the storms. He makes the storms. He can turn the storms on and off. Clearly, he knew a storm was coming. The question then becomes, if the disciples were there with him on the mountainside, Jesus makes them get in the boat and go ahead of him. He knows the storm is coming. The question becomes, did Jesus send them into the storm? A tough message this morning to hear, but a reality that the Bible teaches us is that Jesus did, in fact, send them into the storm. He sent them into the boat and knew he was putting them out into the storm. That's the reality of it. The disciples, many of which were fishermen, going out into a boat and even being in a storm was not the end of the world, but this was no average storm. Now, he has already said to his disciples at one point in the Gospels, In this world you'll have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. He said that to them. So the disciples knew to expect bad things. But the disciples sometimes weren't always the quickest on the draw. And so sometimes they forget what Jesus had already said to them. But what I want to ask you is this. If Jesus sent them out into the storm, the reality is that there's a possibility that Jesus may send us into a storm. And that's hard for some people to grasp. It's hard for some people to imagine that Jesus would do that. But the reality was we see him do it right here. So there are lots of storms in our lives. And I'm not saying that every storm you find yourself in is of God's making and design for you. But sometimes they just might be. And that's a difficult reality for some people to find themselves in. There are storms that are there because fallen world and fallen people do bad things and make bad choices, and storms come. And there are sometimes storms of correction, like in Jonah's case, where he was misbehaving, and a storm had to come to teach Jonah a lesson. But there are times when Jesus will make you get into the boat and send you out into a storm. And there's a reason for that. You're going to find out today what he was trying to teach the disciples in the middle of this storm. My question to you is this, that when you find yourself in the storm, when it hits, what's your immediate response? Is your immediate response, God, get me out of this storm? God, why have you forsaken me? Do we blame God? Or do we ask ourselves, God, will you change me? Will you use the storm to shape me? Will you mature me? Will you grow me? Will you change my heart? Will you destroy my pride? Will you use this storm in a way that will make me a better person for you? Or do we just want out of the storm? Storms can serve as an opportunity to provide humility and dependence. See, they remind us that we're not in control. When these disciples got out there, they were reminded very quickly they had no control over the situation. They didn't control the lightning, the thunder, the waves, or the wind. None of it was in their control. Because sometimes we can get a little bit complacent in our lives. Things can be going so well that we forget we're not in control. And sometimes those storms remind us. Storms have a good way of helping to do that. They shatter the illusion that we're in control of our finances, our health, our church, our ministries, our business. We are not in control of any of those things, but sometimes we get the illusion that we are. You see, the Bible promises storms. Jesus said to the disciples, in this world you'll have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. The Bible tells you that. Now, if you're looking for a place to tell you that storms will never come, that you'll be fine, and you'll be safe, you're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong book. It's not going to happen in the Bible. It's promised throughout the Bible that that's what's going to happen. But the reality is, living in a fallen world, these storms may be there to perfect us, to grow us, to help us to learn. I can remember when Malachi was 18 months old, he had his 4th ear infection. Jen and I both working full time. She went to work. I decided to stay home. We took turns taking him to the doctor. Malachi was 18 months old. I took him to the pediatrician. We walked in. We sat down. We talked to her about it. She said, yep, ear infection. Here's the antibiotics. I said, hey, well, I'm here. I've got some questions. He's been doing some unusual things lately. I just want to share with you. And as I shared the story about Malachi's unusual behaviors, I remember when she said to me the words that I would never really understand at that point. She said, I think your son may have autism. And I didn't hear a lot of what she said after that because, frankly, it was a lot of noise. But I do remember she said, but there's a doctor I'd like you to go see. He's a specialist. He doesn't take insurance, but he's the one to see. He's going to know. So Jen and I, trying to get our heads around this, we scattered a few $100s together. We went to see a specialist. We sat in his office that day. He watched Malachi play for a little while. He did some questioning. He asked us some questions. We spent about an hour and a half with him that day. And he performed for us a diagnosis and said, I do think, in fact, your son has autism. And don't worry, it's high functioning, but there are a lot of things you need to be ready for. And some things you should know, like he's probably never going to graduate from high school. He's probably never going to drive. He's not going to have a typical life. And those are things that you and your family need to get prepared for. Now, Malachi was our firstborn. We were a young couple. We were family. And honestly, in the middle of that storm, as Jen and I tried to wrap our heads around what was happening, all we could think was, God, we've done everything right. We've been in youth ministry. I've been an evangelist. We've been in church every time the doors were open. Jen would sing, and I would preach, and we would do everything we thought we should. Why is this happening to us? And all we wanted was out of the storm. All we wanted was God to tell us that everything was going to be okay. All we wanted was to just not be in that situation. But in the midst of that storm, what we learned, what we discovered, what we grew, how we changed, we would never have experienced any of those things. We would have never been able to see what God was going to do with our family as a result, the way in which he would change and shape and grow us as people. things that Jen and I would never get to experience, things we would never understand, that he would use us to help so many other people, and he would use Malachi to touch so many lives. And frankly, he's 18 years old, and he's going to graduate in 8 months. He drives his own car. We don't know that the doctors are right. And if you've ever met Malachi, you'll know he's the most loving human being you'll ever meet. And he's going to do a lot of great things in his life. But in the middle of that storm, we couldn't understand. We didn't get it. But when we started to let God in on the storm, when we started to recognize we were in that storm to shape and grow us, at 24 months and at 3 years and at 4 years and at 5 years, we watched what God did. We watched how he made such a huge difference. And we knew that this was God's way of helping to shape us. And see, the disciples find themselves in the same place. And in verse 23, it says, after Jesus had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray, and later that night he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. In Mark chapter 6, he tells the same story, but in verse 47, he says, later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. It is important to note that although Jesus sent them into this storm, he put them out there in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, that he saw them the entire time. Mark tells us that Jesus was up on the mountainside praying, but he saw them straining at the oars. Jesus never lost sight of who they are in the middle of that storm. He never took his eyes off of them, even though he knew they were there and he was trying to teach them a lesson. Just because the disciples could not see Jesus did not mean that Jesus could not see them. It did not mean that Jesus was far away. As a matter of fact, sometimes in those storms, he's closer than he's ever been. Why is that? Because we find ourselves drawing very close to him in the middle of those storms, because we realize all of a sudden, remember, that notion that we're in control is broken down. It could mean that he never took his eyes off you in the first place, and he's right there with you the entire time. This is a picture of the Sea of Galilee. Now, from top to bottom, you see there Tiberias on the left. That's where it's sometimes called the Lake of Tiberias. But top to bottom, it's a 13-mile distance, and from left to right, at the widest point, it's about 4 miles. And so what we know is that in Mark's gospel, he tells us that they were in the middle of that lake. So Jesus has left them go ahead, and they're in the middle of that lake in what is a very, very difficult storm. As a matter of fact, the storm, when they use the word buffeted, it's actually the word that's similar to the word torture. It sounds like a very bad storm. This is not your average fisherman out in the storm. They're in the middle of that lake, middle of that sea. Jesus has sent them ahead, and they are struggling. Waves, wind, thunder, lightning, and probably very tired. Mark says that in the middle of the sea that Jesus could see them. And I want to remind you that if you feel like at any point in the middle of this storm that you might be in for a reason, that Jesus has never taken his eyes off of you. And no matter where you are, no matter how far away you might feel, Jesus' eyes are on you the entire time. The psalmist talks about the lilies of the field and how they don't toil or snare. I just ask you, if you've ever walked in a place where nobody else could have possibly planted a flower and you see one growing, and it's just sitting there, perfectly healthy, like someone's been taking care of it every day. Have you ever walked by it and heard it whining? Have you ever heard it concerned or worried? And the psalmist is basically, if that's true, how much more does he care for you? Have you heard the birds complaining lately? If he's going to take care of them, isn't he much more going to take care of you? That's what the psalmist was trying to remind us. He's never taken his eyes off of you. If his eyes are on those creations, why wouldn't his eyes be on you the entire time? He's always watching. He's always with you. Then in verse 25, he goes on to say, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. We see here that the reality is that no matter what happened, not only did Jesus send them into the storm, he saw them in the storm, but the reality is that he came to them in the storm as well. See, Jesus saw them there suffering, struggling, and he did not wait a moment to come and help them. Well, strike that. You see, what happens is Jesus sends them out hours and hours and hours before. See, it says in one of the versions of the story, and I think in Mark's gospel, that it was the fourth watch. Well, that would have been sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Now, Jesus sent them out while there was still daylight, which means they have been in the Sea of Galilee for at least 6, 7, 8 hours in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the lake, with nothing but their oars and their wits about them. The disciples have now been struggling. They've been terrified. They have been scared and maybe even feeling deserted, possibly. I can't help but imagine, though, when Moses was leaving Egypt and the chariots were chasing him to the Red Sea, when he got to the sea and he could hear the chariots, thousands of them, as the Pharaoh was bearing down on the children of Israel, that he himself couldn't have felt some of that same fear and tiredness and desperation and desertion. God, I went through all this in Egypt. We got the children out after all the horrible things that had to happen. We walk all this way to find ourselves trapped at the Red Sea, and now the chariots are coming to kill us. The Pharaoh's going to kill and enslave us. All of that to get me here and to leave me alone. I think about Daniel in the lion's den, right? He gets all the way to the lion's den. He has to be imagining at some point this will end, like God's going to intervene, right? They get to the den. Well, God's going to intervene, right? They're throwing him in the den. He's actually seeing the carcasses of the bodies of the lion has eaten previously. They're laying there in the floor. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they stand for God, and they find themselves thrown into the furnace. They were feeling the flames. And I have to imagine along the way they thought God will intervene. Now, I will tell you that in their particular story, they said, even if he doesn't, it's okay. But along the way, they had to be imagining. And as the furnace was open and they could feel the flames, by the way, the fire was so hot that soldiers who opened it died instantly. They had to feel that flame. They had to smell it. They had to be there in the middle, just like the disciples. But the reality was that even in those stories and others throughout, we saw the sea was parted, the mouth of the lion was shut, the furnace didn't burn them. And in all these stories, including here in this one, that no matter what happened, they were still experiencing the storm. God didn't take that away, but he never left them. He never left them to just die and to be alone. He came to them. The Bible says in the story of the Hebrew children that there was a fourth man in the fire. It was Jesus walking around. We know that the sea parted and the lion's mouth was shut and the furnace didn't burn them, and these men on the sea that day would find deliverance. But God wasn't going to remove the storm because he was trying to teach them something. He was trying to grow them and to shape them. And I know that some of you can feel the chariots coming after you. You can smell the breath of the lion. You can feel the flames. But know that Jesus hasn't left you. He sees you and he is coming to you if he's not already right there. You might feel alone, but know that he's already on his way. Now, in verse 26, he says, when the disciples saw him walk on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. So not only did Jesus see them and come to them, but he spoke to them in the middle of the storm. Here's the thing you should notice. They didn't recognize Jesus, by the way. They thought he was a ghost. You see, here's the problem. They had been out in that storm so long. They were so tired. They were so scared. They were so desperate that when Jesus did show up, they didn't even recognize him. It's a ghost. Now I'll give them credit. It was dark. I got to imagine in the middle of the Lake of Tiberias, it is pitch black. You can't see your hand in front of your face. And all they could sense was someone was walking towards them. And it's a ghost. But I really believe there's a picture here of Jesus saying that when you get in those situations, sometimes you get so desperate, you start to depend on yourself, and you don't even see Jesus right there. And he's speaking to you. It's I. Do not be afraid. You got to imagine that Daniel heard that little voice. Daniel, it's okay. I'm here. Shadrach, I'm here. Moses, lift up your staff. I'm here. Don't be afraid. But some of us have gotten into a situation where though Jesus is speaking to us in the storm, we do not recognize him because we're in complete and utter fear and desperation. I've been to the high school after school some days. We have a big rowing team. I have watched these young men and women row out in the afternoons. They get these rowing machines out. They line the entire hallway with them. And they row for, 45 minutes to an hour. They're young, they're healthy, they're fit. And after an hour, they're tired. I mean, really tired, covered in sweat. Just look like they are just ready for a nap. And that's an hour. These disciples have been on the Lake of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, for over 6, 7, 8 hours, rowing and pushing and trying to survive the storm as the wind and the thunder and the lightning and the fear encapsulates them. They were in such a total state of dependence on themselves, though, they didn't even recognize Jesus. Here's my question. Are you spending so much time trying to manage the situation by yourself, being dependent on who you are and being scared that you don't even hear Jesus' voice in the middle of it? Whatever the storm is that you're going through, if you're in a storm where Jesus has put you there, if you even understand he sees you and he comes to you, but can you hear him? Or are you so consumed with yourself in the middle of it that you've lost sight of Jesus' ability to speak to you in the storm? Are you so consumed with the problem you've lost sight of the solution? Have you ever wondered if the storm is a wake-up call? In verse 28, we take a little detour. It's kind of a story within a story, so I'm going to take a little sermonette walk and we'll come back. But I want to see what happens here with Peter, because Peter's an interesting guy. He does a lot of really interesting things in the New Testament. You learn a lot about Peter, and Peter's the one that Jesus said, on this rock I'll build my church. This is Petros. This is the guy, right? And so Peter here in this boat that night, now remember, they were all scared to death, thought it was a ghost, didn't recognize Jesus, and then Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out into the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? As a side note, I just want to look at Peter, because there's an important story here too, just as important to this whole series. See, what did it take for Peter to get out of the boat? First of all, people give Peter a hard time. The reality is none of the other disciples even managed to get out of the boat. They were still cowering in the corner, right? At least Peter said, Jesus, if it's you, just tell me to come out and I'll stand on the water with you and I'll come to you. Now, just for a moment, think about that, okay? What did it take for Peter to do that? Well, it took three really important things. Number one, he had to reconnect with Christ. See, he had to understand that was Jesus' voice when he called. We have to be so close that we can understand it's him when he does. Because, by the way, all he said is, tell me if it's you, tell me to come. Well, whoever it was standing there could have just said, come. How does he know it's Jesus? Well, clearly he recognized Jesus' voice. He knew the master. You know, when they try to help people who deal with counterfeit money all day, the way that they train them is they put them in front of real money for a very long time. And they count real money over and over and over again. And after that's happened for several days, they will slip in a phony bill. And usually, those who've been trained well will catch it right away. And it's not because they know the counterfeits that well. It's because they're so familiar with the original that they recognize when it's not. The reality is that we must become so familiar with Christ and so connected to him that when he says, come, it's I, we can hear him. And we know it's him. And we step out of the boat. Secondly, he had to remove the distractions. Now remember, the storm hasn't ended. Just because Jesus showed up hasn't changed a thing. He walked out onto the water, waves, wind, thunder, lightning. Nothing's changed. The storm is still going. The disciples are still afraid. They're still fearful for their lives, cowering in the corner. But Peter, in the middle of all this, he is able to withhold all of those distractions that just moments ago had him paralyzed in fear, and he gets out of the boat. He removed all those distractions. How do we know? Because the moment he got distracted by those things, he started to sink. The reality is that we find ourselves so distracted sometimes in this world that we can't focus on who Jesus really is. That's what keeps us from walking with him. It's what keeps us from getting out of the boat. Because even if we're connected to him, but we aren't removing the distractions that keep us away from him, sometimes it'll be something else and Jesus, or something else than Jesus. And we are distracted by those things in life that keep us. The wind and the cracks of the waves and this wind pounding at them keeps them from being able to walk with Jesus. All of a sudden, his fear comes right back, and he finds himself sinking. Lastly, he removed the doubt. Remember, we don't know who this guy is, right? He just walks out of the water, and they said it's a ghost. But Jesus, if it's you, just tell me, and I'll come out and walk with you on the water. Now remember for just a minute. Peter's grown up on the water, around the water. He knows, step in the water, you sink. Step in the water, you sink. Step in the water, you sink. It's not that difficult. We all have raised with physics. We understand science. And now all of a sudden, Peter thinks, step out in the boat, walk on water. Why? Because he removed the doubt that if Jesus himself would walk on the water, and Jesus himself was in control of the science itself, that he himself could do that if he removed the doubt that he had in himself and the world around him. And he did. Why do we know that? Because he steps out of the boat and he walks in the water towards Jesus until he starts to doubt. And the moment he starts to say, I'm not supposed to be able to do this, he starts to sink. The moment he doesn't realize that Jesus is in control and his dependence isn't completely on Jesus, he starts to sink. And so really important things here is, one, you got to connect with Christ so much so that when you hear his voice, you can hear, you know it's him. Secondly, you got to remove all the distractions. What is it that's in your way that's keeping you in your relationship with Christ? And lastly, you got to remove the doubt. See, people think of Jesus as some idea, some theory, some figment of our imagination, or some character we've made up. The reality is he is a real person who came and lived in a real humanity, but was 100% God, who died on a cross, who rose from the grave, who sits at the right hand of the Father. And the Bible says that he intercedes for us daily, which is what happens when he says to his Father, that one's mine. When we have a problem, when we find ourselves in a storm, he recognizes us and says, that one's mine. That's who he is. He's real. He is not some idea. And if you remove the doubts about who Jesus really is, and you allow yourself to genuinely believe and believe in what he's capable of, then when you're in the middle of those storms, you won't worry about it because you'll know that he is in control. Christ does not handle our problems in a certain amount of time. He does not care about our timetables or how busy we are. But sometimes because of that, we go and find something else that we think will solve our problems. He has to be the only choice. But the question is, what if he doesn't? What if he doesn't help? Jesus may not come when you want, do what you want, or follow every direction you've given him, but he does care, and he is all-powerful, and he is capable, and he does control the storm, no matter what day of the week, no matter what time of the year, no matter how busy you are, no matter how bad the storm is. The whole experience with Peter walking on the water happened as the storm raged. Jesus did not remove the problems in the midst of Peter. Like, okay, storm, calm down. Peter's going to walk in the water now. The storm continued. Peter had to be able to do that in the middle of the storm, not without the storm around. That's where trust and faith come in. Our life has to be built on him and him alone, not Jesus and something else, or Jesus then something else, or something else and then Jesus. When we realize he's all we need, we will be totally dependent on him. Then in verse 32, back to the original story. And when they climbed into the boat, because remember now it's Jesus and Peter, that's why there's a they there. Jesus and Peter, Jesus basically dragging Peter back into the boat, probably shaking his head. The wind died down. You got to imagine the disciples like, are you kidding me? After 8 hours out here of straining fear, concern, worry, just sweating, pouring in rain, covered like wet dogs, tired beyond belief, and he steps into the boat and the storm just stops? Are you kidding me? But that's what happened. Jesus stepped into the boat and the storm stopped. So the reality was, not only did he see them, not only did he speak to them, not only did he come to them, but the reality is he did eventually deliver them from the storm. When the time was right, Jesus stepped in and the storm ended. Jesus will deliver from the storm. His mere presence in the boat was enough to command the storm. John 6:21, his version of the same story, he says, then they were willing to take him into the boat. Isn't that sweet of them? And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Ooh, don't miss this. So John's version of the story says, adds one more detail. He says, not only did Jesus step into the boat did the storm stop, but they were right where they were supposed to be when it happened. Now they were in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the storm. Peter comes out, that whole thing happens. Jesus steps into the boat. Not only does the storm stop, but they're right where they were supposed to be to get off the boat and head into town. But don't miss this, because this is the I didn't see that coming part for me. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately they found themselves in the place where they belonged. You see, because if you'll go through this storm and you'll ask God, how can you change me? How can you grow me? What are you trying to teach me? Even if it's a storm that God didn't send you into, that a fallen world has put you into, if you'll give God that ability to say, change me, teach me, grow me in the middle of this storm, when you get to the end, you'll be right where he wants you to be. He talks about himself being the potter and we're the clay. And sometimes we get into the middle of that wheel and he starts to mold us, and it can be painful. And sometimes it can be confusing. But if we will let him do what he needs to do, when we get to the end, we will be right what he wants us to be. Right where he wants us to be. just how he planned. But it means we have to be willing. Jesus will show up, he will deliver you, and he will bring you to the place he wants you. Now, for the lesson for the disciples, found in verse 33, this is the part you really don't see coming. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him. Now remember, those who were in the boat, those are the disciples, okay? Let's not lose sight of that. So the disciples worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Well, I certainly hope so. You're the disciples. Jesus came to you and said, give up your fishing, your physician practice, give up all of your worldly possessions and follow me. They have been wandering around following this man, watching him heal, watching him speak to others, watching him do amazing things. And they get put out into a storm. The storm stops, and the first thing they can say is, "Truly you're the Son of God?" Well, I certainly hope so. That's why you were following him in the first place. But what does that tell me? It means that Jesus knew they weren't truly there yet. There still had to be doubt. There still had to be fear. There still had to be concern. And Jesus sent them out into the storm that night to prove to them one more time just who he is. In all the stories we've talked about with Lazarus last week, with Rachel, and others that we've shared in this series, Jesus keeps saying, "I'm the Messiah. I'm the Messiah. I'm the promised one. I'm the one who will deliver. I'm the one who will heal." And even the disciples had to be taught that lesson. And the question is, what is God trying to teach you in the storm? Maybe he's trying to humble you. Maybe he's trying to remind you who he is. Maybe he wants to perform a miracle in your life. Maybe it is that he just wants to remind you just who he is. Because even the disciples found themselves in a boat, still not quite sure. Because if they were sure, why would they have to say, "Oh, you must be the Son of God," after watching that? You see, I watched you open blinded eyes, but there was this. And I watched you heal that woman of her blood issue, but then I saw you do this here. Jesus sent them out there to teach them a lesson. The reality was he knew they were not ready. And in just a short period of time, he was going to give up his life for them and for the rest of humanity. And he needed to make sure they knew that he was God. When you finally see Jesus for who he is and allow him to command your storms, you will genuinely understand the love that God has for you and how much he cares. Some of you find yourselves into a storm today. You don't have any perspective. Maybe today's the first time you've ever heard that it might be a storm of God's own choosing. That's hard to sometimes feel. Remember, Jonah was thrown out into the sea to correct him. So sometimes that can be the case. And sometimes we live in a fallen world with bad people who do bad things, and we find ourselves in storms because of that. Sometimes because we're the person, and sometimes because of other people who've done stupid things. But this morning, I'd just like for a moment to think about the fact that maybe this is a storm designed by God just for you, to help grow you, change you, shape you, teach you, and to help you be completely dependent, so that when this all happens, you will say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Would you stand with me today? I want to pray for you before we sing. I don't know what you're struggling with today. I don't know what your storm is, but I don't know the one who controls the storms. And so in just a moment, we're going to give you an opportunity to respond to the message, but I want to pray for you before we do that. And today, maybe you've forgotten that Jesus is right there in the middle of your storm. Maybe you have been taking the storm on yourself. The fear and the desertion and the feeling of hopelessness has overwhelmed you because you've lost sight of the fact that Jesus is right there, that he cares greatly for you, that he's speaking to you. And today maybe is the day that you want to come and just say, "God, I give up. I've been trying to handle this storm alone, and now I see that you're trying to do something in this storm to me, to help me, to grow me, even if it's not a storm of your own choosing, even if it's a storm because someone else did something stupid, or maybe it's a storm of correction because maybe God's trying to put you back on the right path." But whatever the case may be, it's your storm, and God wants to use it today to do something great in you. Lord, today I thank you so much for your word. I thank you for how profound it is. I thank you for your sovereignty, for knowing what we need to hear, and for sharing stories that almost 2,000 years ago still ring true for us as a lesson here today. God, there are people in this congregation going through their storms. You know what those storms are. You know why they're there. You know what they're for. God, today I pray there'll be people who will respond to you and say, "God, I give up. I'm handing this storm off to you. I know that I'm here either because correction, because of a fallen world, or because you're trying to change me, do something in me. And today I just want to surrender it all to you. Lord, I hope that you would help them to respond to that today, that you would give them the reality that you are in control, and you've never left them and you've never forsaken them. And if they'll just trust in you and rely on you and depend on you, that you'll be the one to master that storm with them. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. Today's your opportunity. The altar is open. If today's the day you want to just come and say, Jesus, I know this storm's here for a reason. I want you to teach me, grow me, change me. Feel free today to come as you sing.